So make sure you have the last three flashcards on your desk right now. And at the end of the video, you can just write the answers on the back. So just wait to the end. So in this video, I want to take a look at some more things that occurred during the New South era in Georgia history, but more specifically, the setbacks of Black people in the state, as well as the rise of some influential Black leaders. So one of the setbacks that occurred was something called Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws were laws that made it illegal for blacks and whites to have separate everything in the state of Georgia. So they had separate parks, separate water fountains, separate pools. They could not marry outside their race. And you get the point. So these are some examples of Jim Crow laws in effect. So as you can see in the back where it has that colored sign, that's where black people sat, and then the white people sat in the front of this bus. It even went so far as to where white people could only apply to certain jobs where black people were not allowed to apply. So one of the biggest cases that challenged Jim Crow laws was Plessy versus Ferguson. And this man here, Homer Plessy, was a biracial man. He was mixed with black and white and a few other things, but he could pass for white. And he was sitting in a whites only section of this train, and he was arrested for it. And he sued the state of Louisiana for saying his rights were violated, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that indeed Louisiana did nothing wrong, and that black and white people could have separate everything, just as long as they were equal. So that whole doctrine of separate but equal, that came from this. Now we know in practice, black people in white establishments were never equal. Usually the black people had the more lesser than or the more rundown establishments than whites did. But it would be many years later before that was changed and overruled. Now, another setback to blacks in the state was the use of disenfranchisement. Now, we know the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. And remember, a lot of white Democrats were not very much in favor of this. So, to use little tricks to keep black people out of polls and from voting, they had different tricks. So, these tricks were here. So, one way was poll tax. So, a poll tax is you had to pay $1 tax to vote. Now in 2025, $1 does not seem like a lot, but back in the day it was. Some people were only making $1 a week. So you had to choose between either feeding your family or voting. You also had to take a literacy test. So a literacy test means you were required to learn how to, or not learn, sorry, to prove you could read and write. Now remember, a lot of African Americans during slave times were not allowed to learn how to read and write. So they would fail this part, or you had some black people who actually did pass the literacy test, but the whites that were grading it still failed them and said they failed. Then you had the grandfather clause, which this really let a lot of those poor white men be able to vote because basically it said if your father was able to vote before the Civil War, then so could you. Now remember, pre-Civil War, black people were slaves, so they didn't get the right to vote until the 15th Amendment, which came after the Civil War. So this is an example of a poll tax receipt and a literacy test. Now remember the KKK, we're talking about them again. Their goal was to keep black people down and to keep the same social order pre-Civil War. So to keep black men from voting and going to the poll, they will stand outside to intimidate them, beat them with violence. And between 1882 and 1930, there were about 482 lynchings that occurred in the state of Georgia alone by the KKK. Now, one of the bloodiest massacres in Georgia history was the 1906 Atlanta race riot. It has also occurred during this time period in Georgia history. And what happened was you had newspaper articles like here that were saying pretty much that black people were raping and assaulting white women. So, of course, when race relations are very heavy during this time, that angered a lot of those unemployed white men because at this time, white men who were actually the unemployed ones, they were already jealous and envious of black people because they felt like they're taking our jobs, they're stepping into our territories, they're doing this, that, and the third. So as a result, those white guys, they all marched through downtown Atlanta and they began attacking any black person they saw in sight. They even destroying black businesses, beating them, beating the owners, etc. It had got so bad that the Georgia governor had to call in the Georgia military to break it up. And as a result, there were 25 blacks that were killed and several injured during that interaction or that riot massacre, I would say. Now, to look at some of the rise of some of our influential black leaders in Georgia, we have Booker T. Washington, which is this man right here. Now, we talked a little bit about Booker T. Washington. We talked about him giving his Atlanta Compromise speech at the International Cotton Exposition. So, just to kind of reiterate that, he was known for giving the Atlanta Compromise speech, and he was born a slave. He would end up becoming free, going to college, etc. So he ended up making, or not making, but creating the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And remember in his Atlanta Compromise speech that he gave, he said black people could wait for civil rights later, but their way to get civil rights was to showing through hard work and education. Now, this man here, W.E.B. Du Bois, was very much opposite of Washington on his views of civil rights. And he also was the founder of the NAACP. Now, Du Bois felt like, you know what? We waited too long for civil rights and we need it now. So while Washington felt like, you know what, we can have civil rights later, improve ourselves through hard work, Du Bois said, you know what? No, we need it now. So he did a lot more, hence the NAACP, to get civil rights for black people sooner rather than later. Now, this man here, Alonzo Herndon, he was the first black Atlanta millionaire. So his big thing was a lot of his accomplishments included he opened up three very fabulous and fancy barbershops in the Jonesboro area. If you don't know what Jonesboro is, that's in Clayton County. And it's not far from the city of Atlanta. He also was known, which is a lot of his best, big chunk of his wealth came from here, is he started the Atlanta Life Insurance Company. So a lot of white companies would not insure or give black people life insurance. So that's life insurance, and when you die, that it helps your family pay to bury you, etc. So he started his own life insurance company that insured black people, and it became very profitable, and it's still around to this day. He also owned a lot of real estate. So he sold a lot of different houses. So he owned over 100 real estate properties throughout the Southeast. And this is the inside of one of his barbershops. Now his barbershop's no longer around. They end up closing down. But his barbershop's one of the barbershops that during the race riot that those white men, they went and destroyed. All right. So pause the video right here and go ahead and write these answers on the back of your flashcards.